根据我国经济的实际出发。
According to the actual economic conditions in China, we will take the supply-side structural reform as the mainstream of developing new concepts and leading economic development under the new normal. In this way, we will implement 5 policy pillars, namely stable macro policies, precise industrial policies, flexible micro policies, pragmatic reform policies, and thorough social policies.
The new normal, a transition from a manufacturing-led to a consumer-driven economy, topped China's economic transformation agenda during this year's political season. The nation will now begin implementing its 13th five-year plan for social and economic development over the next 5 years, and also confronting challenges on the foreign policy front. But China has also firmly cemented its role as Africa's largest trading partner, with relations said to be at new highs at the end of last year. So what will these supply-side reforms mean for the continent? And what role does Africa have to play in China's economic transformation? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. China's top legislature, the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the country's top political advisory body, convened its annual sessions from the 2nd to the 16th of March this year. Now, 2016 is seen as a pivotal year for China, as the country has begun shifting towards a new normal for economic growth rates.
From excessive industrial capacity to tumbling stock market, China's continued economic slowdown in 2015 has left some people wondering whether there's something going wrong.
We didn't actually do too bad because there were worse expectations that China's economic growth could fall below 6.5, but in the end we managed 6.9. And given that the IMF has time and again lowered the expectation of the global economic growth drive.
In 2015, China registered the lowest GDP growth rate in a quarter of a century. In most previous years, China's growth was above the target and often by a large margin. But authorities say that last year's growth still met the government's target of approximately 7%. Each year, that target is announced in the government's work report as the National People's Congress kicks off. It's one of the most highly discussed issues during the political season. China is the only large industrial country that still sets a specific target of growth, which governments of all levels try to meet as much as they can. But some say that as China is becoming more intertwined with the global market, its economic performance is not just decided by domestic factors, and that an overemphasis on numbers could end up damaging to China's economy. Over the past 2 decades, China has been making massive investment projects to meet the economic targets. It helped achieve an economic miracle, but at the cost of worsening environment, rising economic imbalance, and excessive industrial capacity.
As long as we can guarantee a stable job market and inflation, it's the quality of growth that matters, not quantity. In 2016, our target of growth is between 6.5 to 7%.
A range rather than a point of the growth target, many believe it signals the country is gradually shifting its focus from economic figures to addressing some of the biggest economic challenges. As for what are those challenges ahead in 2016?
Well, excessive capacity. So we have been talking along for the last 5 years about the reducing the excessive capacity, and so far we did not really achieve much. This year, I think the government is extremely decisive.
The real problem for the Chinese government is how does it redistribute land, labor and capital across the economy, and that's a very difficult thing for them to achieve.
As the National People's Congress kicks off, deputies from across the country will discuss and cast their votes on the next move of the world's second largest economy. Han Peng, CCTV, Beijing.
Now, 2016 is the first year in the final stage of China's goal of building a moderately prosperous society by 2020. Whether the world's second largest economy reaches that goal would very much affect the world's political and economic development. And that's why diplomats from many countries have been expressing great interest during this year's two sessions.
Well, the development of China is also affecting the rest of the world, and for us as a developing country, we are very much focused on the developments in China to see how we can learn from that. So that's why we are very much with the eyes wide open following all the developments that are taking place here.
I think China is moving into a different phase now, phase of knowledge and IT and technology. So looking forward to see what's going on.
Well, it's a very important occasion, a deliberative moment for the government of China, always important in all nations. And of course, this year, the most important issue is the consideration of the five-year plan. Five-year plan is always a fundamental instrument of understanding what China is proposing to do. And what China proposes to do is of relevance not just to China, but for the whole world.
I think there's going to be some interesting messages as to the progress made on key issues such as the structural reforms, which are very important. The Chinese view on how China is going to keep facing the international economic environment, and I'm sure that what he presents in his comprehensive report will give us some interesting inputs on what we should be watching out for in terms of the Chinese economy, Chinese social policy, and political process over the next year.
Now, CCTV's Tang Bo was at the news conference where the supply side reform decisions were announced. He told us more about what the members had to say about reform.
When asked about the difficulties of the reform, one of the member answers saying that he admits that it's going to be a painful journey because to deal with the overcapacity, we have to close some factories, some companies, but that could result in an increasing number of unemployed workers. But they prefer, instead of continuing supporting these dying companies, they prefer to take care of those unemployed workers. They can re-educate them and they can continue to contribute to the economic growth of the country. And also the entrepreneurship as well as innovation is also very important for this reform. And at the same time, one of the members saying that to deal with the overcapacity, the problem is very severe, especially among the state-owned enterprises. Especially they have the problem of high investment at the same time, high in debt. So the key to the solution is to change the way of thinking, to change the business model, and do something more on the technological innovation. And he says that we need more small scale of operation to meet the need of different clients, and that's one of the way out for the reform.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will help unpack the decisions made during China's political season and what the new normal will mean for African relations. Do stay with us.
Again, Chinese lawmakers and advisors will converge on Beijing to discuss sustainable growth and the rule of law. Dynamic debates about the government's work report will promote transparency and shore up confidence. The world is watching. Voices and votes. Our coverage of the political consultative process. Stay tuned to CCTV News.
At all levels, we see China, of course, increasingly. I mean, China's economy now is at $11 trillion economy. And the size of that economy itself is impactful, not only globally but also in Africa. So these economic political ties will continue to be even much stronger now and in the years ahead.
That was the African Union Commission Deputy Chair Erastus Mwenche speaking of the importance of China-Africa relations. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, during China's political season, issues such as economic growth and ongoing reform have been closely followed by politicians and analysts. Let's take a look at some of their views.
I've been watching what's going on in China. I'm aware the Chinese government attaches great importance to its economic growth. As China's population policy changes and living standards improve, there will be a new labor force coming in. These factors will stimulate China's domestic needs for resources, which will ensure its economic growth.
Domestic growth is very important to China. China will remain the world's largest trader. This will also be key to reviving the world economy. In addition, China's Belt and Road Initiative will contribute to the world economic growth. Cooperation in production capacity and technology will help propel the development of other countries. Lastly, the internationalization of the Chinese currency, especially the RMB, became part of the SDR basket, will also be important.
Now, to help unpack China's economic transformation and its relation to the African continent, I have expert guests standing by. In Nairobi, Professor Michael Shege. He's the Kenyan government advisor on international development partnerships. In Johannesburg, Mr. Michael Sudekasa. He's the CEO of the African Business Group. And in Beijing, Dr. Liu Yufa. He's a former president of the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, thank you for joining in the conversation. Dr. Liu, in Beijing, let me start off with you, though. The transition from a manufacturing-led to a consumer and services-led economy, that is China's new normal. First of all, broadly speaking, though, what does that entail, and why should Africa be interested?
Well, I think with the current trend of Chinese economic transformation, my African friends, or to put it broadly, the African countries, should be taking stock from these areas. The first area is the trade. As China has been expanding its appetite for more imported goods and services, the African manufacturers can manufacture the tradable goods and services which would be popular at the Chinese market. And secondly, it is with regard to the capital which would be flowing from China to the African destinations where they can find the ready market, ready partners. Thirdly, it relates to the industrial cooperation, which would entail the infrastructure which is badly needed by most of the African countries across the continent. Secondly, it entails the manufacturing sector, and thirdly, it entails the manufacture-related service sectors. The cooperation could expand to include the areas of education and so on.
Right. Mr. Sudekasa, though, how closely is Africa following China's economic transformation, and what will be the likely impact for Africa?
Well, I definitely think that Africa is paying close attention to developments in China, particularly because over the last 10 years, China has been a major trading partner, principally for natural resources. But as China moves towards the services sector, you have what I'd call outlier lead countries like Ethiopia and South Africa, taking advantage and inviting Chinese industrialists to set up factories in their countries to look at both the continental market, but then also re-export to Europe, back to Asia, and also to the United States. So I think we're definitely looking, and there is that interest in having technical expertise, education, as well as the capital. So we're paying close attention.
Professor Chege, though, for Kenya, right from the standard gauge railway to the green energy projects, its partnership with China is huge. What's Kenya's view?
Kenya's view is that we should intensify our relationship with the People's Republic of China, particularly since they are not involved in raw material extraction kind of industries here, in the building of our infrastructure. Standard gauge railway, which is Nairobi-Mombasa, is just one phase, being extended to Naivasha after the FOCAC summit agreement last year in South Africa. But also, as you mentioned, green energy, geothermal power, exploiting geothermal power, and the construction industry generally. Our relationships with China are basically trade-based, other than investment. And we're importing hugely for manufacturing components, equipment, transport related goods, capital goods generally, a bit of manufactured goods like in medicine and so forth. But People's Republic of China is importing precious little from here. And I think as we're talking about the new normal in China, we should be looking at what China should be importing from here. And by the way, when you say import, it means it's something like tourism. Because Chinese tourism coming to Kenya fulfills more or less the same purpose as us sending exports to China, because it brings in foreign exchange from that point of view.
Mr. Sudekasero, of course, even though for Kenya its trade with China, its relationship with China is basically trade-based, but the whole question of Africa's commodities, though, Africa being a net exporter of raw materials, what will the new normal for China mean? Does that mean that it will be importing less commodities, though, from Africa?
Well, for those countries who are really dependent upon commodity exports, it means exactly that. We're interested to see how China handles this particular period, because the growth that was experienced over the last decade has slowed, it's tempered, there's not as much, and this is really globally, import of natural resources, and it is harming our oil exporting countries, our mining countries, and I think that it's also making African countries look at other sectors like tourism, like the agricultural sector, as a way to keep the growth that's being projected on the continent going. I mean, I think what Africa has going for it is the fact that in the next 34 years, the population is expected to double. So we're creating markets on the continent for intra-African trade as well, and I think that shouldn't be underestimated. But definitely the fact that China, to some extent India, and definitely the Western countries are not importing at the same rate as they used to is causing African countries to rethink our strategies in terms of just exporting natural resources. The plus of that, though, is that we are looking to add value, so that what gets exported from the continent are value-added products. And as my colleague in Kenya mentioned, China does have a role to play as a purchaser of value-added products from the continent.
Right. Professor Chege, is there a concern, though, from this part of the continent?
As far as we're concerned, of course, the new normal and the impact it has had on exporters of extractive goods like oil and other minerals, as my colleague is saying, from South Africa. In fact, the slowing down of growth in Chinese economy occurring at the same time as the slump in Europe and the slowdown of growth in the OECD countries has affected African raw material export. But this does not mean that we cannot restructure our trade and investment relations with China. We should be thinking hard about these issues, and especially from an African point of view. I believe that there should be continued interest in Chinese investment in infrastructure. in Africa, but not just Chinese as contractors. When, like in my country, Kenya, a lot of the investment funding is coming out from multilateral sources like the World Bank and the African Development Bank, the EU, and so on. And the Chinese are bidding for projects and doing them in an exceptionally good fashion and in a good time.
Right. Dr. Liu, you did mention industrial cooperation and manufacturing and how exactly Africa could take advantage of China's new normal. What's your take?
Okay. Let me take the opportunity to offer my kind of personal understanding. With regard to the new normals here in China, the African countries could take these areas into consideration. First of all, as my colleagues have said, the Chinese and the African entrepreneurs could join hands to process the primary industrial products so they can add value before they are exported back to China or to be exported to the international markets. And secondly, they could jointly manufacturing the products which would be marketable not only back to Asia, to China in particular, but also to Europe, to USA, to South American markets, where many countries have been offering the quota-free and the tariff-free treatment to the African products. And more importantly, African countries at the moment need badly to upgrade the infrastructure, which would in turn help to connect the individual markets, which would be the precondition for the industrialization process across the continent. Back to you.
All right. Mr. Sudekasa, though, is there an opportunity here for African countries? I mean, in terms of if Chinese companies, for instance, were to relocate or export their manufacturing sectors abroad, is there an opportunity here for Africa, particularly since it has been chasing the dream of industrialization?
No, there's a huge opportunity, and I think that this is a period when a confluence of events are unfolding that will definitely inure to the continent's benefit. You have an initiative that the new Partnership for Africa's Development is launching called Move Africa, with the idea of bringing down the cross-border barriers that have been in existence. Things like aligning the rail systems, making sure that you have one border posts as you try and move goods and people around the continent. China has been playing a role principally at a national level, but I think there are opportunities in the regional level to improve infrastructure, as both colleagues have mentioned. And that's critical for the realization of the real market size and the market power and the purchasing power that the continent has to purchase goods from various parts of the continent. But you have emerging industrial centers of excellence, Kenya being one, in East Africa, Tanzania closely behind it. South Africa has really, I think, benefited significantly from Chinese higher-end or higher technology investment for production for other markets. The African Growth and Opportunity Act really presents an opportunity for Africa-based manufacturing for tariff-free entry into the United States, which is a huge potential for the continent. In West Africa, Nigeria is starting to look at manufacturing automobiles and trucks for that large, almost 200 million person market. So there's definitely, I see opportunity. And just before I close my comment on this, the area of renewable energy, I think, is a critical one. The African Development Bank has created, the new president has created a high five of priorities. Energy is one of them. China is the world's leader in solar energy in particular, but also a major adopter of renewable energies in general. And so transferring that technology, setting up continental-based platforms would be beneficial both for Chinese investors and definitely for the continent.
There's clearly opportunity there, Professor Chege, though, but what would make Africa an attractive destination in this regard?
First of all, we have to realize that for the factories that are relocating out of China, we are competing with countries closer to China, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, even countries like Indonesia and Bangladesh. This is where, at the moment, most of the companies that are relocating from China are heading. Why are we at a disadvantage compared to Vietnam and the others? First of all, as my colleagues are saying, our infrastructure is very poor. Transporting goods inland from our ports takes too long and is much too expensive. Our energy costs here in Kenya, here in Eastern Africa, are way above what they are in India and China and in Vietnam and places like that. Our labor costs also tend to be higher compared to those countries. We have to look at our own internal markets first and look at what are called the supply constraints, if you like. The infrastructure, an enabling environment. There's too much corruption, by the way, come to think of it. All these issues need to be addressed fast so that those companies will find these African countries a good place to locate and come. And as my colleagues have just said, Ethiopia points to a very fine example, particularly in textiles and leather products. We have seen some movement in places like Rwanda, South Africa, and I'm sure that we are going to move. But first of all, we must do our homework as Africans.
Dr. Liu, a final comment from you, though. Do you see this as Africa's opportune moment to industrialize?
Definitely, the moment has long been standing there. But starting from a couple of years back, it is the golden opportunity for African countries to take stock from the transformation of the Chinese industries to improve their infrastructure, social environment. They can, provide better social environment where the Chinese capital would be moving forward and join hands with the local partners. We have a saying in English, it takes two to tango. In fact, in this case, it's a group dancing between China and the African countries. We have to look forward. This is the golden opportunity which would not be standing there alone. Some other countries are also competing for the same Chinese capital. Back to you.
All right, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Nairobi, Professor Michael Chege, he's the Kenyan government advisor on international development partnerships. In Johannesburg, Mr. Michael Sudakasa, he's the CEO of the African Business Group. And in Beijing, Dr. Liu Yufa, he's a former president of the China Institute of International Studies. Remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.